Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the session on getting more out of biomedical innovation. Hopefully you're all in the right place. My name is Esther Krofah. I serve as Senior Director at FasterCures, which is a center of the Milken Institute. So we're just delighted to have all of you here, and also delighted by the panel that we have assembled, which actually represents a really fantastic cross-section of the biomedical innovation ecosystem. We're joined by Amitabh Chandra, who is the Malcolm Weiner Professor of Social Policy at Harvard Kennedy School. He's also the McCance Family Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School. Kaf Draza, who is the K. Ranga Rama Kirshman Associate Professor of Psychiatry at Duke University. Pat Furlong, to my left, who's President and CEO of the Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy. Chris Hite, Vice Chairman and Global Head of Healthcare at Citi. And Pablo Legorreta, founder and CEO of Royalty Pharma. You can get more about their biographies in your program. This issue is actually very near and dear to our hearts at FasterCures. We are fortunate, for those of you who attended this morning's session with Francis Collins, who talked about the fact that science is really the best that it's ever been. And we're really beginning to see cures for diseases that we once thought were impossible, such as blindness, sickle cell, and using advancements in the body's own immune system to fight disease. And yet, despite these breakthroughs, we've had robust investments with governments, disease foundations, the private sector, and philanthropies that have allowed us to achieve all of this. But yet, it remains risky, the science is unpredictable, and the knowledge that's needed to make meaningful advances often unfolds many years after it's needed. And then from the patient's perspective, it's often too late. Additionally, the burden of disease and investment in R&D is not always correlated. For example, heart disease remains the #1 cause of death worldwide. It accounts for more than 30% of all global deaths. And yet the discovery of new cardiovascular medicines, it's at its lowest point and represents less than 10% of global research and development spending. And we're seeing similar trends across diabetes, dementia, and addiction. And we recognize that the global system that produces the treatments that we all want and need does not work optimally for patients. And the metrics that we traditionally use to describe how we're progressing in innovation, the annual number of drugs that are approved, the cost and success rates of each stage of development, it does not fully characterize innovation process or its impact on health outcomes. And we need new ways to collectively measure the success of our R&D investments and new ways to incentivize behaviors across the entire ecosystem. So this panel is going to explore these questions because at the heart of it all, we talk about drug development, but at the end of the day, patients continue to suffer. And what should we be doing about that? Amitabh, I'm going to start with you to help us frame this discussion a little bit further and to talk about what is the global burden of disease, what do we mean when we say that? Also to talk about how do we even think about success of the ecosystem? Is that even the right way to talk about that? And how would we describe innovation? And I know you've done a lot of work in that area. Amitabh?
Wow, thank you. I also just, I think I'm the only economist on the panel, and so I think I'm going to be, fair warning, the skunk at the garden party. And so I can't believe you started with me.
Uphill from here.
Yeah. Let me, I'm going to answer all your questions, but the where I want to get to at the end is to say, look, we're getting a lot from global medical innovation. This is really, when we write the history of the early 21st century, it will be the history of global medical innovation. What interests me, though, is can we get even more? So I'm not happy with just getting a lot. I think that relative to the science that the planet is capable of, we don't get enough innovation, right? And that's a statement about investing more in science. And if we can invest more in science, I think capital markets will actually try to commercialize that science. So that's where I would like to go at the end of my opening remarks. So I think when we say prevalence of disease or the global prevalence of disease, too often it's easy to just look at the improvements in life expectancy. That's incredibly important. But I think what we can do better. we can kind of note that the disease burden is more than just death. It's living with suffering. So when we think about schizophrenia, right? I may not die of schizophrenia, but I might live with schizophrenia and as a result just not live to my capabilities and my full capacities. And so I think the measure of the global burden of disease has to do more than just count deaths. It has to count the number of years of healthy life that a patient was not able to realize, right? That has to be the definition of the global burden of disease, and that has to be the metric by which we measure our progress. So not only are we reducing deaths from cancer, but are we improving the quality of life for oncology patients, for Alzheimer's patients, for kids with type 1 diabetes. And so that's why I keep coming back to FasterCures and saying we need cures, right? The cures don't have to be pharmacological. They could be prevention, right? It could be treatment. So this is not a way of saying privileging one side of the industry over another. So that was kind of point number one. Point number two is I see a pretty big mismatch between where capital markets go and the global burden of disease. And I don't think that, look, I'm a finance professor. I understand exactly why this happens. In fact, I teach why it ought to happen. But I don't think that is a great recipe for reducing the global burden of disease. So last year, something like 500,000 children died of malaria. We have one active clinical trial underway for malaria. We have 27 clinical trials underway today for gout. Gout is like the opposite of malaria. It's like a disease of excess. Right? And so that is this incredible mismatch where capital markets go, where the reimbursement is lucrative, rare diseases and oncology. It also goes where the failure rates are relatively low. Or if it goes into areas of medicine where the failure rates are high, like Alzheimer's, it goes into it sometimes because there's high willingness to pay at the end of the day. So one of the things I would love to learn from my fellow panelists is what are the different incentives that we can give companies, innovators, scientists to actually do better science that would alter where the money goes, right? So if we could de-risk Alzheimer's drug development a little bit more through, we're all very proud about the great work that the NIH is doing. Yes, but this is a massive disease, and I think the NIH needs even more money than the money it has to take on Alzheimer's and to take on mental disease. And if the NIH could de-risk the basic science, capital markets will say, now I need a much lower cost of capital to do the phase 2 and the phase 3 and the phase 1 trials, and so money will flow. And so I think thinking much more about what are the incentives for great drug development, what would they look like for certain diseases where R&D is extraordinarily difficult and expensive to do? We need to think with much more ambition than we have. We need to think much more than, we're going to give these manufacturers 5 years of exclusivity. That's a very timid way to think about it. I think we need to say, if you give the world a gene drive for malaria and save the lives of 500,000 people, we will give you 30 years, 50 years. We'll give you $1 trillion to I think we need that scale of imagination to reduce the burden of disease.
I mean, a lot of thoughts to pick up from, and to the point that you made of let's give NIH even more money. We need more investment in basic science. How are the incentive structures structured? And maybe if you could comment on this and talk about this from a basic science perspective, where sometimes the science happens much, much earlier, obviously, than before we can actually even talk about specific therapeutic benefit. How do we align that part of the ecosystem that they're oriented around what the patients need when it could feel as though you have really decades that go in between that?
So let me start by just following up on some of the comments that my colleague made. And this idea of burden of disease, right? And I think for me, in my experience as a psychiatrist, given the burden of disease and how extensive it is, I think a lot of times we talk about the patients, but it's very clear to see how far the burden of disease extends when you've lived with somebody who has depression, or you've taken care, or you have a family member that has Alzheimer's or autism, right? And so the burden of disease is something that extends far beyond even the person that is sick in the beginning. And I think that's the starting point for us to think about how emergent these diseases are and thinking about how to treat them. So I think about a specific population that really plays a critical role in this pipeline. So we talked about cardiovascular disease. And I think about some innovations that have happened in the last 30, 40 years in particular, and the scientists that led those innovations, right? And this is those that understood how cholesterol moved in and out and how they're processed in cells, as well as the scientists who worked on developing the processes by which cells get information out, right? And there are classes of diseases or treatments that came out of these, whether it's the statins in one case or the beta blockers in the other cases. And what's really unique about these scientists is that they were actually physicians. So I think it's important as you think about the pipeline of innovators, the physicians play a really unique part in that enterprise, right? So I think there's certainly utility to understanding pure basic science, right? How does bacteria work? How does bacteria defend against viruses? And then having somebody that translates that into a treatment like CRISPR, right? But there's a certain sequence that research has to go in to ultimately get into helping people in the end. The physicians ask very specific questions about how do I understand biology, but biology in a way that's useful for treating disease. And so if you look over time, that population, the physician scientists, right, those who are trained as physicians, has diminished in the total population, right? The age that it takes for individuals to get their first independence has gone up, and there are a lot of factors around that the NIH has spent time studying. There was a report out in 2014 which really detailed how these individuals are at risk in the overall population of scientists. And so that includes things like the increasing debt associated with going to medical school, and then figuring out how to incentivize people to get into doing research earlier. And they've been working on ways to address that. But I think that's a really important part of the research ecosystem that we have to understand plays a critical role in getting research to patients.
I mean, could you comment on the idea that basic scientists or academic institutions that perform research are driven by the dollars they get in terms of grant funding, the citations they get out of their publications, the ability for tenureship? Are those the right sets of metrics at the basic science level?
It's complicated, right? So I think there are a lot of ecosystems with a lot of their drivers, right? And so there's a role for pure basic science for the sake of basic science alone, right? There's a lot of innovation that's come out of folks who just simply ask questions about how nature works. And it might be another group of scientists who takes that innovation and does what's called translation. In other words, turning it into a useful therapeutic. And so the ecosystem that drives folks in, the incentive structures that drives folks in, you want to optimize that group's need to do science, right? And so that might be papers, that might be tenure, right? There are a lot of things we can talk about that system, but you do want it to be a driver of talent in to produce product out. Right?
Yep.
You may want to also simultaneously think about some of the challenges we face now in that ecosystem, right? And so there's aging of our biomedical workforce in the country. And so you want to think about how to right-size that ecosystem so young people continue to have attractors in. If you go 40 years ago, about half of the people who went through what we call postdoctoral training, so after you do graduate work, you get additional training, half of those ended up in the academic setting, right? Now it's actually 20%. And so there's this incredible population of scientists that are almost mismatched with the environment or the ecosystem that they're training in. And so I think there are a lot of changes that we can make in that area as well. We've been wrestling with this with regards to thinking about the brain, right? And how to understand the brain and translate or take advantage of this young population of scientists. And we realized that one of the things that might be critically important is training people in different ecosystems simultaneously. So is there an opportunity to take someone who's a postdoc and you sort of spend a year in a startup, a year in academia, a year in big pharma, and you learn how the intersection of those ecosystems, you drive innovation by balancing those out?
You know, so it sounds as though there is a role, obviously, for some of those incentives. We should talk about what the future should be, if there's any realignment that's needed there. Pat, I thought you could talk a little bit about, from the patient's perspective, while all of this is happening and the drivers of science are moving at their pace, for those who are living through their disease experience, is the system working?
So I can say to you from a pediatric rare disease perspective, I'll first start with investment. The investors in pediatric rare disease research are the advocacy organizations, before you get an NIH grant, you have to have data. You have to have some basic investment. So we're the investors. We find the people. We coerce others to join that force. We recruit by fellowships. We find the doctors. We establish the standards of care. So we're the primary investors. Once you can get an NIH grant, that's all well and good. But we should be initial partners in this. And often when we invest in academic centers or an investigator in an academic center, if we have language that says a return on investment, the academic centers won't accept our money anymore. They're like, no return. So you're the early investor, but you get no return, which is a problem, right? And the second thing is, in pediatric rare progressive diseases, my mother said it best, you can't die well over 20 years. So instead of counting survival, we look at quality of life. This is a disease, and most of these diseases affect families, extended families, caregivers. They're incredible burdens. And we've done preference studies on our community in Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And invariably, the data suggests that quality over quantity of life. These individuals, their families, their caregivers, and the individuals who have this disease want a quality of life. So they want us to invest in that quality of life. So I think in this ecosystem that we keep talking about, I hear continuously this reference is bench to bedside. I totally disagree with the definition. It's bedside to bench to bedside. It is we who have diagnosis that are at the bedside of these people who decide what to do next, where to invest, how to collect, how to envision this machine, and then go to the NIH with these folks and try to leverage money. On the other side of this, in terms of trying to drive translation, it is us who meets with the FDA to talk about living with, what it means, what value we would place on some sort of intervention, what meaningful difference that would make. For instance, if somebody extended the lives of these young men rather than some other opportunity that might improve their arm function so they could plug in their computers, so they could use their phone, so they could raise their hand in class. All of that matters, not the fact that you're 50 years old and totally immobile and can't breathe on your own. That's not the quality of life they're deserving. So I think partnering with rare disease and advocacy organizations at the very basic level and embedding them throughout the process is the way that we're going to have success. We want to invest, we want to make a difference, and we want to roll back that investment to reinvest and extend our programs. So I think we missed this huge opportunity by starting with the academics and the physicians. All of those are important, but we're all in this together.
So Pat, you talked about patients and patient organizations being investors, and we also know there is another class of investors along the entire system. In fact, I would say the entire ecosystem is marked by the choices and the decisions of investors. Chris, I thought you could touch on, what does this mean? What does this whole question around, is the biomedical innovation ecosystem working for patients? How do investors think about that, particularly when they need to make real-time decisions about return expectations? How do we balance those sets of considerations, and then what patients are actually looking for?
It's a great question. Investors win when the companies they invest in win, and that means successful clinical trials, getting drugs to market that ultimately help patients. I think there is, the biotech sector in the public markets has never been more successful. Between 2008 and 2013, there were about 50 companies that went public. They raised just under $5 billion. Since 2014, there's been over 200 companies come public in the biotech sector. They've raised about $25 billion through their IPOs, and then through secondary offerings, they raised another 75. So they've raised $100 billion from the public investing side to do research. And it's research much later than research coming out of the NIH, academia, et cetera. And those stocks that they've invested in have won. I mean, the reason why there was 50 IPOs last year instead of 0. There were 0 in 2008, 0 in 2009, maybe 5 in 2010. There were 50 last year. The stocks on average have gone up quite dramatically. And they're going up because the companies themselves have been successful. Now the issue is how many malaria companies went public? 0, right? How many cardiovascular companies went public? 0. How many diabetes companies went public? 0. What companies are going public? Oncology, gene therapy, cell therapy. How many antibiotic companies went public? A few, and a couple of them actually went bankrupt. And so there is a disconnect we spent a lot of time yesterday on the FasterCures board of that burden on the U.S. health system for these obesity, mental illness, dementia. Those are major costs for our health system, but the early innovation dollars around public markets, not necessarily NIH, public markets are not going there.
We'll come back to why not. Let's talk about that next. But Pablo, could you talk a little bit more around the productivity of R&D? How are we doing now compared to where we've been?
Sure, and first I'll start by agreeing with Chris, because at the end of the day, what happens in this ecosystem is that money, investors follow science. And that's why it's so important to start with a very rich, meaningful investment in NIH funding, which is really at the top of the cascade of what generates this incredible ecosystem. My perspective is the perspective of an investor in life sciences, where what we do is we acquire royalties. We're at the end of this ecosystem, but still providing a useful service because, for example, UCLA here in LA had a product that was discovered there, had a royalty. We acquired it for $1 billion. That money went back into this recycling of capital to continue to invest. And in terms of how productive this ecosystem is, I also agree with Chris, and I'd like just to share some data with the audience and maybe have slide number 1. And there's been a lot of talk of how this, whether pharma investment is productive or not. Price Waterhouse does this analysis where they actually look at IRR on investment by big pharma. And you can see at the top how it's been coming down to very low single digits. Now, the reality is that this is missing the really exciting part of the industry, which is biotech, and I'll get to that in a second. But what's happening is that, you know, the R&D productivity at the bigger companies is declining. The cost to develop drugs has increased. And also because now a lot of the development is in drugs that are treating very targeted diseases for subsets of patient populations where these drugs are very effective. The drugs don't end up being as big as in the past. But in the past, the drugs that we had were treating broad patient populations, not very effectively. And it was probably not the best investment. But the industry is changing in a very dramatic way. And if we go to the next slide, what you see here is the other picture that emerges with biotech. And what you see here is a graph that shows from 1997 the returns of the biotech sector. And what you can see here is that it just pales the success, the productivity, and the returns to investors when you compare it to the S&P or pharma. You know, 30x multiplication of invested capital in biotech over the period here, 97 to 2009. About a 17% IRR versus single-digit returns for the other part of the industry where there's a lot of focus, which is big pharma. So there's no question that this industry is going through a very profound transformation that we've been living through the last 50 years. 50 years ago, we had this fully integrated pharmaceutical companies where everything was happening within one company, the discovery and the development. Today, we have an ecosystem where we have a very vibrant academic sector that is where everything is being discovered, huge innovation. Then biotech, chaotic, small companies. Some do extremely well, others do not, but the results are there. And what's happened, and this is the big challenge that we're facing now, is that the discovery and the development has been disconnected, because discovery is happening at academia, and then development is happening at biotech and big pharma. And that creates this famous valley of death, where, you know, it's difficult to take the discoveries into the clinic and translate the discoveries into medicines. But slowly, it's having great success. And if I can just go to the last slide 3, what this really shows is the incredible success of biotech and our ecosystem. So if you look at the top 30 drugs in 2000, 18 years ago, only 4 biotech drugs. You look at the picture today, top 30 drugs, all of the ones highlighted in blue, 20 of the top 30 are biotech drugs. Of the top 10 drugs, 9 of them are biotech. Now, they end up in big pharma because big pharma ends up acquiring these companies, but it really shows the dynamism of the US and now global ecosystem. So I think we need to understand that this is working. Investors understand this, and you can see it because a lot of capital is being raised into biotech. And I truly believe that we are now in the golden age of science because of things that have happened through NIH investment years ago, mapping the human genome and many other things. And now we're also in the golden age of biotech. And it's a great, great industry where the US dominates, and we have to keep on holding that position. I really think we need, all of us here in this room, go and talk to Congress, talk to people about funding NIH. $40 billion per year in NIH funding versus a $3.5 trillion budget of the US government, $600 billion invested in defense. We need to invest in life sciences.
There was a slide actually that Dr. Collins put up this morning that talked about there were the 7,000 rare diseases, about 500 treatments. And then you talked about the global burden of disease, Amitabh, and how we need to think more about the diseases that affect the mass. Is it mutually exclusive in the sense of, can we do both at the same time? Can we continue to develop and advance the amazing science that has come forward while at the same time not neglecting those who real time feel as though they've been left behind?
Yeah, I don't think that there's an automatic trade-off, but I do think we need more novel incentives to help people who are not us. And so let me just make that more concrete. Look, to the extent that novel CAR-Ts that are developed here make their way to India, the country that I was born in, that's great. And it's not like the global burden of disease around the world does not overlap with the US burden of disease. So to the extent that there's cystic fibrosis in India, when a company in Palo Alto or Cambridge finds a CRISPR-Cas9 based cure for cystic fibrosis, that cure will eventually make its way, hopefully quickly, to India. So that is awesome. What's not awesome is what about the diseases that we don't have, right? So then I come back to malaria. We don't have malaria. So it's actually a small disease for capital markets. It's a huge disease in terms of burden of disease, but it's just a very, very small disease for capital markets to chase. But we could make it more attractive to capital markets to chase innovations in malaria if we either de-risk the R&D through bigger investments in the life sciences earlier on, or we did things like the voucher system that the FDA has, where like if you make a drug for a disease that is incredibly prevalent in the rest of the world, you can get a voucher to have another drug, like an oncology drug, approved 6 months faster. I think we need much more of that kind of thinking. So I don't think that the fact that we're doing more orphan R&D means that we're doing less malaria research. I think capital markets have an infinite amount of money. So if we do, what we want is more money to go into malaria, not money from rare diseases to go into malaria. No, we don't want that at all. Because if the rare disease folks have done really good work at de-risking rare disease R&D, they should win. We need to de-risk the rest of the portfolio, which is something we've not done. If I have a minute, though, I just wanted to say, I worry a lot about one part of this, which is we have this view that if we give the NIH more money, magic will happen. And I think that is true in so many ways. I think the problem is one, we don't give the NIH enough money, but two, the NIH has to often give that money to universities. I think we're the least efficient players in this ecosystem, right? So it could be producing doctors, but the reality is we have a huge appetite for NIH indirects, which is very different than a huge appetite to do great drug discovery. So I think Congress has a real opportunity to think about, putting us on a diet.
Yeah. Let me extend.
Yes, I was going to go to you, but also I want Chris to react to this comment about infinite amount of money.
Do you want to? Why don't you?
Let Kaf go first, and then
sure.
we'll come back to Chris.
So I've been thinking about the ecosystem a lot, and instead of asking why, asking more why not, right? And the way science and biomedical research has changed over the last 40 years. right? So there was a time where if you want to isolate a gene, you spend most of your time behind a pipette, right? And now if you want to understand genetics, you get online, call 23andMe, send it to them, and you get all of the data back, because this can happen in a much quicker time frame. And there's a massive shift that's happened that I don't think we've completely capitalized on, and that's the idea that science isn't just data collection anymore. There's analysis now, right? And there are multiple areas in which we think about neuroscience in which there are investigators who are collecting all the information and putting it online, right? And this is everything from like the human connectome that talks about how parts of the brain are connected to each other, to even efforts in the Brain Initiative where you're going to gather a lot of data from some labs and then make it available online. And so now if the data is online and available, then you start asking the question, well, where does innovation have to happen, right? Does it still have to happen in an academic setting if the information is available? And perhaps you might say the way this should go is the way of computer science, right? Where the most innovative person is literally the high school student, right? Or the first-year college student. And perhaps that's a way where we can transform and bring innovation, right? It's a parallel incentive structure, but it's another way of bringing ideas forward without the limitation of that setting.
Yeah, absolutely. Chris, there's an idea that we can just pour more money into the system and get more magic out. Is that true?
It's interesting. When you think about, and there's obviously some very famous books around, sort of national goals, right? The moonshot was a national goal, Kennedy, right? And that was an engineering problem for the most part. And then Nixon did the war on cancer, right? And at the time, the understanding of biology was rudimentary in genes and how and oncogenes and how they were mutated, and I think our understanding of biology is advancing at a super accelerated rate. But I do believe that a lot of the real groundbreaking translational research that leads to ultimately therapies that help patients doesn't occur within pharma or even biotech public companies. I think it really does occur at academia because, our understanding, it is a sort of translational research effort, and I do think that, to me, it's not about pouring money in to, sometimes more money makes things more efficient, right? Large pharma has a lot of money, but they're not really going after some of these things. So I think it's really the creativity at these academia institutions, the NIH-sponsored things. So it's not necessarily, more money, right? But I do think, I agree with what Pablo said. I think, and we had a big session at FasterCures yesterday, the research that, what is really happening in Alzheimer's, what is really happening in cardiovascular disease, mental illness, who's really going after that? The public companies aren't going to do that because the public investors are saying, do not do that. It's a deep hole, too long, too expensive. We don't want you to invest there. That's why it has to be, I think, at academia and NIH sponsored. And there, I think you need to really pile in more money.
So we talked a little bit about inefficiencies in academia, and yet you're suggesting that academia is where we need to focus our attention.
I just don't think large pharma and biotech have the wherewithal, the patience of public company investors who are judging them quarter to quarter. That's just not where I think research is going to happen.
But it's even more fundamental because if we look at how drugs were discovered 50 years ago, it was trial and error, and it was driven by chemistry. So it was a totally different problem than what we have today. Today, the way we develop drugs is because of the profound understanding that we now have of human biology. And so today, innovation is driven by biology. And biology is not at big pharma, is not at biotech. A little bit, but it's not there. It's at academia. So I think at the end of the day, the investment has to happen at academia, and money will follow. And I do get the point that, there are diseases maybe that do not afflict, the richer countries of the world. And it is a problem because, a lot of the investment is happening in diseases that, end up being more prevalent in the richer countries. And that requires a solution, a lot of thinking, very complicated. But I think also what happens if you think of things like malaria and other diseases, maybe science somehow will eventually, because there is research happening at academia, will figure out how to treat that through a completely novel way that was never thought of before. If that happens, if there is a way now to treat these diseases because science gets there, the money will follow. So I think that's the ecosystem we have, and I think it does require a lot more restructuring and thinking how to make it more efficient. But it's working pretty well, I think.
I'll give you a quick, great example.
Yeah.
Large pharma, Keytruda, and Pablo can speak a little bit about it, but Keytruda was developed by Organon, which was bought by Schering-Plough, which was bought by Merck. And Schering-Plough tried to kill it, and so did Merck. And when Bristol-Myers Squibb bought Medarex, it was not for Opdivo, it was for Yervoy. They actually valued Opdivo as a negative NPV when they were looking at buying the assets. So I think
what happened is when Merck, when Bristol ran trials and they realized that Opdivo was an extraordinary drug, immuno-oncology drug to treat cancer in a completely novel way using the immune system's strengths, then the guys at Merck said, "Oh, we have one of those.
Yeah.
Let's invest in it instead of killing it." But it's anyway.
Well, I mean, so this conversation obviously reflects the fact that the system, whether that's the investment system or the academic system, operates based on sets of incentives that they collect and they're motivated by, right? But at the end of the day, right, it's the patients themselves that are at the beginning and at the end of the entire ecosystem, and they're embedded. And Pat, you talked about that we need the voice of the patient at each and every single part of the system. How can the patients actually be key decision makers and not just subject to the decisions, that they are not just seen as subjects, but they're viewed as active participants in the decision about their research and their care?
Well, I think we can't collectively talk about the patient, right, from mental health issues to Alzheimer's disease to pediatrics. We have to separate out who are we talking about and how are we managing this. The investment in pediatric rare diseases is significant, and we're all delighted to see that come forward. But the investment in infrastructure is not there, right? So what happens in pediatric rare diseases is a company looks at a target, builds a house essentially, does conducts their clinical trial on a subset of that population, assuming that it's going to be generalizable, right? And then what occurs there is you have in Duchenne, for instance, or in other diseases, you target a population that you think you can measure and have an outcome measure that is going to show you some significant difference, right? But the people who are too young or perhaps too debilitated are outside the window. So then you take down that house and you have a decision, a regulatory decision. And if it's positive, then what happens is the payers say no, because you've tested this small population of people, this subset, that may or may not be reflective of the whole. So then patients are again faced outside the window of a novel therapeutic that may well change the quality of their lives. I think we have to invest in infrastructure. I think that all patients and all people should be part of a system of care, that we can look at these populations. For instance, I really love platform studies in pediatric rare diseases. We treat babies without even knowing what we're treating them with or why. We just think, well, that worked in adults, and we'll just try it here and hope for the best. This is no way to treat our pediatric population. We need to build infrastructure so that they're all included in a trial, and so that you go to the FDA or whatever regulatory body and say, we are looking at the outcome measure in this subset, but actually we have safety across, so that those labels become reasonable. These patients are left waiting for years. If we think about most of these pediatric diseases in the narrow inclusion criteria, you have one chance in that trajectory of your illness to participate, maybe, and no chance at all to take advantage of a therapeutic, likely, in your lifetime. We have to invest not only in academic centers that, while I think they're terrific, they silo data, they will not collaborate across. And we have to make sure that they're collaborating, that they're putting natural history data together, not just siloing data so that they can sell it to a company. We struggle because we've gone to the NIH and said, there's 4 natural history studies in our disease. And they say we encourage them to share. Well, good, but they don't. So encourage is not is not sufficient to get data out there. And you're right, high school people can look at this and people trained, but if everyone has a chance to participate, then we're listening to that voice, we're looking across, we're trying to understand safety, and you're included. And that's the only way you're going to get that patient voice. And it's essential because otherwise you're out of the bus for your lifetime. And that's not fair.
So, Kof, I mean, I think a lot rests on you, right, from the academic institution perspective. And being an investigator yourself, can you touch on this idea of collaboration and sharing data, but also this idea that we just need greater efficiencies with academic medical research, and that maybe that's where the solution lies to accelerating innovation?
Yeah, so I spent about a year and a half working on a congressionally mandated committee looking at young investigators and how best to support them in the country. And while a lot of times when people think about NIH and it's linked to academia, it turns out academia isn't the only thing that NIH funds, right? So one of the areas that we spend a particular amount of time looking at is small business. So through the Small Business Innovative Research Program, so the SBIRs, right? And the idea there is that the government tries to fund small business to also take on biomedical research as well. And there's a lot of back and forth onto how well this has worked across time, but one of the thinking there was, could we create a structure or a system also that happens to be funded by the NIH that tackles some of these incentive structures, right? And what you ultimately can think about doing is creating a system that then competes against academia, right? With the idea that competition might make both systems work better. So you might say the best way to have collaboration is if we fund the research in this setting across small businesses working together, then they share data. That might then compete against the investigators wanting to do it in the academic setting such that they respond in the same way. So I think there's opportunities to build a different type of parallel structure that then sort of right-sizes academia with the goal of getting treatments to patients sooner and also bringing in new people to the system.
Can you touch on this idea of collaboration and sharing data? Do we just need to do that more? What are the incentives?
Yeah, so there are incredible challenges. I've been thinking about this through the perspective of the BRAIN Initiative. So just to give you an understanding of the problem, right? So we're talking about a single brain, right? We want to understand the human brain. Over 200 billion cells, half of which process electricity, and that electricity is changing 1,000 times a second, right? And you're talking about one brain out of the 9 billion in the world and trying to understand that and understand how it's responding and reacting to all of the different situations and scenarios that a human encounters every day and how the past history of the environmental experiences is marched onto that brain such that you will respond in a new way the next time, right? So it's an incredible data challenge, right? We couldn't store that much data 10, 15 years ago, right? And we certainly don't even know how to move that much data around such that one can share it. Like, where are you going to download it? Where are you going to store it, right? And so in that, as part of building out the BRAIN Initiative, we have to think really critically about how do you create data standards, right? Such that you can take data from one place. How do you move it? Where do you store it? What is the capacity? And so all of that has to happen in parallel. Well, I can tell you as a trained neuroscientist, engineer, and psychiatrist, my training is not about thinking about how to create data standards and share them across universities such that we can discover new types of information using things like machine learning, which is not also in my background training either, right? So we found that it's critically important as we're building things out to bring in people from other disciplines. And one of the critical parts of the BRAIN Initiative is to create attractors such that we bring in other disciplines to think about the problem, not at the end stage, right? Not after each individual lab has collected the data to say, how do we now make it align and share it? It's to say, at the beginning, how do we design this in such a way that it can be shared? And if it's going to take 10 years to collect the data, we should be simultaneously working those 10 years to create the platform to share it, not waiting till afterwards, because then that takes 20 years.
So, yeah, before I do have a question for you, actually, Amitabh. So at FasterCures, one of the things that we are working on is how do we take a step back from this conversation and create some transparency around this idea of the performance of the system for patients. Can we even do that? So other parts of the system are moving towards performance measures and accountability, whether for health plans or whether it's on the delivery system. Increasingly so, we see various types of metrics that even CMS is holding different parts of their system accountable for. And yet we come to biomedical R&D and medical research, no such scorecard or performance measures exist in a universal way, not in each silo, but across the entire spectrum, that a patient organization or any other member of the public can say, this system is working well, or it's not working so well, or here are the areas that needs to be improved. Is it even possible for us to tackle that kind of a challenge and create some transparency that we can be more articulate in saying what's broken and what's working well?
Yeah, absolutely. I was just going to say one thing. I think one reason that we in academia sit on our data is, as individual scientists, most of us don't want to sit on our data. We want to collaborate, but we don't. And I think one reason is because of insufficient public funding for the science. So what we do is we enter into a relationship with a biotech or pharma company where I get $20 million to study X, but as part of that contract, I agree not to share the findings. And so I'm no longer doing basic science, and I'm no longer producing a public good. I'm producing a private good for a biotech company. And I think that is the consequence of what happens in an environment where we don't fund science as aggressively as our GDP actually allows us to do. So I think I want to think of, there are other, I'm not saying that that is the only reason, but I'm saying that's something we should pay attention to. There's a raft of collaborations that my university has recently entered into that we celebrate in the pages of the New York Times. All of them will result in less data sharing, right? Because we're getting money from a biotech company to do great research, but the key is that then the IP from that goes to the biotech company, right? So a lot of other biotech companies would love to learn how does resistance build in patients who are on Keytruda versus Opdivo? They would love to know the answer to that. That's sort of, it's not basic science, it's more like translational science. When that knowledge is unlocked at the Broad or is unlocked at the Department of, whatever, molecular biology at Harvard University, that answer will go to the biotech company. So that we have to think about. And I think, but coming back to your question about can we map things better, I think we can, I think we should. I think that it's incredibly important to map progress against the global burden of disease, and the burden of disease cannot be the prevalence of the disease, because that would be a way of penalizing progress against orphan disease. Because we will say, oh my gosh, Usher syndrome, 25 patients a year, who cares if we cured it? I think the right frame is Usher syndrome, it's within our scientific grasp, it's a debilitating medical condition. Let's measure the quality of life lost associated with Ushers. Do that for lots and lots of other conditions. So that's point number one. Point number two is, if we find a mismatch between where the capital markets and pharma companies and biotech companies go and the global burden of disease, I think we should do some soul searching and ask why. We cannot go back and saying bad pharma company, bad capital markets. It's probably an incentives problem, or it's probably an insufficient investment in science problem. So I would love to work with you on that map so that we can look at it ourselves as opposed to finger point to the people who are actually doing the hard work in the industry.
That's right. Pablo, I know you wanted to comment maybe on the question around data sharing and whether there's transparency that can be created around that, or if that's even possible. And yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so the problem you lay out for us is real, but I think incentives will work to a certain degree. The problem is that it's much more of a problem of the fundamental structure where you have this disconnect, this valley of death. And I'd like to share maybe one thing that is happening that I think is really cutting edge, that is trying to address this issue. And it's a partnership in New York among three incredible organizations, Weill Cornell, Memorial Sloan Kettering, and Rockefeller University. I'm actually involved at the board level at Rockefeller, and I've been looking at this. So what these institutions did is recognizing that they are producing science, and there's this valley of death where you need to run experiments to figure out whether what you have there could become a drug. And then once you have run those experiments, there's money, for sure. Capital markets, venture capital firms, and recognizing that problem, what they decided to do, instead of sitting in their hands and waiting for companies to come and see if they could provide capital, but then there's issues because they want the data, they said, let's form a partnership among the three institutions. It's called Tri-Institutional TDI, Therapeutic Development, Inc. They pooled resources, hired 35 biochemists and other people, have labs, and what they're doing now is everything that comes out of those institutions could go into TDI. TDI runs the experiments. The typical academic scientist, to get money for the experiments that he needs to run, takes him 2 to 3 years to get money. Why? Because he goes and talks to venture capital firms, biotechs. He gets 20 no's before he gets a yes. So these institutions, by having this entity and having capital, because the trustees put a lot of money behind it, another company did, now can run the experiments. And they have now, and this is done purely based on science. Is the science there? The decisions are not based on the company has a therapeutic focus or bias, which often results in the decision not based in science. Here it's made based on science. It works, I invest. It doesn't work, I kill it. So it is the way of the future. And what we're trying to do now, and that's why I got involved, is to see if we can bring institutional capital to this new thing, TDI. If we manage to do that, to bring institutional capital to TDI, it will change how translational research is done in this country. Now, the amazing thing is that the guy that came up with this, 3 people, Mark Tessel-Levine, who ran Rockefeller, Laurie Glimcher, who ran Weill Cornell, and Craig Thompson, who runs MSK. Mark left Rockefeller, came to run Stanford University, and he's trying to do the same here in the West Coast. So these things are starting to spring up, in different parts of the country. Laurie Glimcher went to Dana-Farber at Boston. She's trying to do something there. And this will take us a long way towards trying to make part of the ecosystem where we have this huge gap much more efficient.
Yes, Chris.
One thing that, and I keep coming back to the slide that FasterCures said, which is the burden to the health system just in the U.S. for obesity, mental health, pain, Alzheimer's runs over the last 10 years into hundreds, probably approaching $1 trillion, right? But the investment spending is very small. And you talked about mismatch, right? The mismatch. And I think, the public companies just aren't there right now because I think it still has to occur at the basic research level.
Yep.
And, and that's why I think the funding at the NIH is so critically important because public companies still aren't designed. Who wants to take on another beta amyloid Alzheimer's trial?
Right.
Not one. Their investors would throw up on them. And so I think you have to continue, and a lot of it is the advocacy groups, right? Going to the NIH, coming up with new technologies, new basic research that ultimately 5 and 10 and 20 years may end up in a public company, right? And I think there's great successes that show that, right? Duchenne's, all the rare diseases, gene therapy. We tried gene therapy in the 90s, it failed, it fell on its face, right? And here today we have gene therapy products approved. And so I think it's just a matter of time. And it really comes down to, we still don't know enough about Alzheimer's. We don't know enough about diabetes. It has to occur at basic research level. And my only point is, public companies just aren't doing that. I don't think they're capable of doing it because the pressures of the public investors don't allow them to take the time, the 15 to 20 years and the billions of dollars to spend. And that's why I think it has to be at a national level. It has to be a national goal that we set for our country.
Well, that begins to get into this conversation around the incentives and where do the incentives lie and who's responsible for providing those incentives. Maybe all of you could just speak to, just really quickly, what do you think the incentives should be from the part of the ecosystem that you represent that will make a significant change in how we think about where the investment lie, what products are developed, what disease areas are actually being investigated? Kaf, do you want to start?
Yeah, so I'll follow up just by making a comment about Alzheimer's disease, right? And so people invested an incredible amount in this idea of beta amyloid and figuring out how to get rid of it. And there are 2 studies that really stick out to me in the last couple of years that have come out. And they're not what you think they would be, right? And so in one case, they took light and shone it in an animal's eye at a certain frequency, and they found that they could activate the immune system in part of the brain that processes light, and it chewed up beta amyloid. And then another set of experiments, they did this with sound, and they found that they could activate the cells, and they chewed up beta amyloid, right? And what these 2, they're preclinical studies, but what they argued is that instead of thinking about a drug that could get rid of beta amyloid, you might just be able to shine light and sound, right? And that might be a great way of thinking about treating the disease, right? And so it shows that there's opportunities for innovation that can grow in a different way. Now, what you would want to do as soon as possible is take those preclinical studies and figure out how would we scale and build a platform which we would test these hypotheses, first, right? Because if that's the right answer, you might be able to draw investors into basically creating soundtracks, right? And flashlights, which would be a way of thinking about reducing amyloid in the brain instead of going through the drug trial.
Yeah, great. Amitabh, incentives. What do you think the appropriate incentive structures should be?
I think so. I have two incentives structures. One would be on the very early side. If we're going to give the NIH more money, we have to make sure that that money is efficiently spent, and that requires weaning universities off their addiction to NIH indirects. So that money would go much further. It would actually go to the scientists as opposed to the chancellor's office. That's one. On the back end side, right now we give successful companies who build great drugs 5 years of exclusivity, or 12 years if it's a biologic. I think we have got to think about saying to pharma companies and biotech companies, if you give us a drug for Alzheimer's that, say, delays the early onset of dementia by a year, I'm making up that number, we can have that debate, we will give you 10 years of exclusivity. You delay it by 5 years, we'll give you 25 years of exclusivity. This is a way of closing the gap in incentives that pharma and biotech companies face. Right now, as it was said earlier, they have no incentive to do a lot of the basic science that needs to be done. But the more you allow them to capture the value of the innovation that they have brought to market, the more the incentive they have to do that. So I think we could pre-specify novel exclusivity periods. So we're not hijacked by paying a lot of money for low-value drugs. We pre-specify what the high-value drug is, what is its criteria, and how many years of exclusivity we get. That is within our grasp.
That's great. With a few seconds we have left, can I just get one word answer on your incentive, and then we'll close the session since we're out of time. Pat, what's your one incentive in one word?
2 words.
2 words.
Include patients throughout the drug development paradigm.
Good. Chris?
I actually like that idea of extending the patent life. That's pretty good.
Not the patent life.
The exclusivity.
Not patent life. I know how this works.
I kind of like that.
It's the same thing for an investor.
That's right.
It's really the same thing.
Yeah.
Good.
What I would say is this ecosystem that we have in this country is extraordinary. I've been all around the world. It doesn't exist anywhere else. It's been perfecting itself over 50 years. It's academia, it's patent lawyers, it's licensed experts, it's the biotechs, the venture capitalists. And 75% of the drugs that are coming out around the world come out of this ecosystem. It's going to change, but we should figure out how to protect it and how to bolster it through regulatory change, through funding early stage. Anyway,
Please join me in thanking this wonderful panel and the discussion.
Thank you, Esther.